so what we're going to do is actually we're going to hear from the speakers of various sort of regulatory schemes that exist. For medical cannabis, we're sort of the odd man out in a lot of ways. And so as we are winning, we're trying to figure out where we're going, right? And this panel represents my advisors in thinking this through. And so this is sort of a dialogue that we're having, and I'm excited that we're going to be having this here. So Ethan, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Steph. I want to start by addressing what happened yesterday. If anybody was alarmed with the exchange between Rick Doblin and me, Rick and I are great friends going back 20 years. When I got out of my sabbatical in the Amazonian jungle, one of the first people I called was Rick, and it's his fault that I'm involved in this whole thing. When he offered me up as a sacrificial lamb to the NIDA process, anyway, you can read that whole story on maps.org. Anyway, plus I have the advantage today because I get to talk to you more about this, and he doesn't have the ability to retort. So what we're going to talk about this afternoon, just for a little bit, and I'll try to talk fast because we were told to only take a little time. I'm going to talk about the pharmaceutical development of cannabis. And a lot of this is the way it is rather than the way I want it to be, so please don't kill the messenger necessarily. So this starts out with what I like to call the 4 pillars of a true medicine. As you see, you have to prove that it works, that it's efficacious, that it's safe, that it's standardized. It's the same over time. And additionally, to be a good medicine, it has to be accessible, and there are various factors involved there. Oh, this thing's balky again. Okay. So a pharmaceutical medicine, cannabis-based, has to be standardized, consistent, and it has to have a quality that's as good as any new chemical entity. That's what you call a synthesized medicine. It also has to have a delivery system that's practical for the patient, that's safe, that minimizes risk. That would include intoxication, which is not something that the FDA wants to see in a drug. You also have to demonstrate that it doesn't have a high drug abuse liability, which will affect its scheduling and accessibility. And we have to know what its side effects are. It also has to have a supply chain, a route from the manufacturer to the patient to ensure that it's not diverted. And again, that it's accessible and affordable. Could you advance, please? If there were a pharmaceutical prescription form of cannabis, it would have advantages for a lot of people in that it would be something that had proven safe and effective in clinical trials. Therefore, physicians would be comfortable prescribing it, pharmacists in dispensing it, patients would have more confidence in it, and presumably third-party payers would cover it as well as government health plans. Black market cannabis, so generally smoked, cannot gain regulatory approval in most nations. There's great variability, as you've seen in the material. We can't be sure that something called White Widow is going to be the same one week to the next in a dispensary. Additionally, you've heard a lot about the various pitfalls that are possible in terms of molds, coliform bacteria, pesticides, heavy metals, et cetera. Additionally, again, if I need to reemphasize, the most customary mode of administration, that of smoking, is something that is not going to be acceptable to the Food and Drug Administration. There are various reasons for this, including the pulmonary side effects. Additionally, this mode of administration is akin to intravenous injection and is most likely to produce rapid spikes in serum and brain levels that are most likely going to produce intoxication and increase the risk that there'll be reinforcement. That is, that somebody will want more and more and more to reproduce the feeling that they're trying to attain. what patients really want from their medicine is relief of pain and other symptoms without necessarily having any alteration of consciousness. I'm not going to get into a big thing about whether euphoria is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's not usually why people take a medicine. So this one is different in that regard. Again, patients want a consistent effect, and they want something that their doctor can prescribe and they don't have to go to the black market to obtain. Then there's the whole issue of whether a botanical can even be made into a medicine. There are two that are available in the US, and this may come as a surprise to you. One is just a topical agent, cinecatechins, made from tea. It's approved for treatment of venereal warts. It's a topical, and that has a less stringent path to approval than a medicine that's taken internally, but there is one of those. Crofelemer, but it's not a true botanical. It is a single molecular agent that is derived from a plant, and that's used to treat diarrhea from HIV. So to date, there's not a true botanical, a multi-ingredient medicine that's been taken internally that's been approved by the FDA. But there is a blueprint for doing, oh boy, okay, one more. There is a blueprint for botanical medicines becoming pharmaceutical agents, and you may be surprised to see the date on this, 2004. There's been this botanical guidance, and it lists all the steps. Now, I can sum up a lot of this to say that it's all the same things that you have to do with a new chemical entity, and that is it's got to go through 3 phases of clinical trials, being proved safe and effective. It has to have various toxicity studies in animals, et cetera, et cetera. And then if that weren't enough, every year or two, Congress comes up with additional things that you have to do, and these include such things as proving that it doesn't affect conduction in the heart. Some drugs prolong the QT interval. It has to be monitored for contaminants. You have to do human drug abuse liability studies if the drug is psychoactive. And you also have to study it in patients who might be on dialysis or have hepatic impairment to see if there's a safe dose they can take or whether it has to be contraindicated in that kind of patient. Then there's the whole thing, particularly with botanicals, about their purity. Now, what we've got here is nabiximols or Sativex, the oromucosal cannabis-based medicine extract being developed by GW Pharmaceuticals, as compared to Moroccan soap bar hashish. Now, these have only one thing in common in that they both have about equal amounts of THC and CBD. But if we look at a thin layer chromatography, you'll see here nabiximols has THC and CBD, no CBN, cannabinol, which is an oxidative breakdown product of THC. You've got faint bands of terpenoids in both, and then the soap bar has all this stuff. Those are contaminants. Now, contaminants in soap bar can include soap, wax, camel hair, even camel dung. I don't think that these are things that one would normally wish to inhale, particularly for medicinal purposes. Now, we've heard a lot about this whole session this morning. I'll just reiterate that on the black market, a lot of the cannabis is being analyzed in labs, but there are real problems with this in that most of the labs, at least under federal law, are operating illegally because they're handling Schedule I substances when they test your cannabis. There's very little uniformity in the methodology that they're using. There are very poor quality controls, and there's the phenomenon of dry labbing, which is just a euphemism for saying that, well, it's got a lot of trichomes and it looks like a 22% to me. It is funny, only because it's so sad, but that's what's going on. It's important that anyone knows you can't take a weekend course in analytical chemistry and be able to set up a lab, but there are plenty of people who are doing it. cannabinoids are very tough to assay properly. And in fact, if you're going to look at terpenoids, they're even much tougher to do. The amounts are tiny in comparison to the cannabinoids, but they're therapeutically very important. So it's not to be taken lightly. Next topic is standardization. This is evidence that the drug is chemically consistent and identical in structure and dose over time. This is one of the sine qua nons of a prescription medicine. And it's a real challenge for botanicals because the innate variability in the plant. You know, if you have a bad growing season for your plant outside, it's not going to have the same constituents. And for Sativex, it's a very controlled process. And that's reflected in this. This is a biochemical fingerprint of nabiximols or Sativex. And this is 25 batches of medicine over 9 years. Now, what you'll notice is a bunch of peaks. But what you don't see is that the peaks are stacked. They look like single peaks. This is how closely they superimpose. Now, this is very good for Sativex. This is very bad for the next botanical that comes down the road because it establishes a benchmark that others are going to have to meet if they want to be approved to be taken internally. So this has made it very hard for the next guy that wishes to put their botanical medicine through a similar FDA approval process. Now, we've heard a little about this previously. These are medical efficacy, levels of evidence. What we have mostly to date is the bigger numbers, which are not as good. Case series about cannabis, historical cohort of case control studies, moving up to small RCTs with unclear results. I'm afraid, for better or worse, all the studies of smoked cannabis in this country, at best, are level 2. What level 1 requires is large randomized controlled trials with clear-cut results. That's all the FDA cares about, and that's all that most physicians care about in terms of evidence-based proof. So that is it. So randomized clinical trials are the sine qua non of medical proof. There are 3 phases. Or 4 if you want to look at that. Phase 1 is testing the drug in normal people to see its pharmacokinetics, how much is in the blood, and pharmacodynamics, what effects or side effects there are. Phase 2 is testing on smaller numbers of patients, 60, 100, something like that, in a specific disease condition where you're trying to get your indication, pain or something else, and you assess its safety and efficacy. Just for example, Epidiolex, the cannabidiol product, which is being used for intractable seizures, is currently in phase 2 in the USA. Phase 3 is testing in larger, hundreds of patients. Again, safety and efficacy. Sativex is in phase 3 for cancer pain in this country, and it's approved for spasticity in 26 countries already. Just to give you another comparison, these are just a list. I realize this is small. I put it up here just to show that there have been many studies, published studies of Sativex, nabiximols in pain, almost all very positive, good p-values. In comparison, there have been several studies of smoked cannabis for pain done in the US, all in California. But these were all done for a few days in relatively small numbers of patients. If you put them all together, it amounts to 3 patient years of data. Well, that sounds okay until you realize that the studies of pain for Sativex amount to 6,000 patient years. And that's just the published material. The numbers of patients who've had it are well over 30,000. So there's a big difference there. And you know, it has to be said that in terms of clinical investigation of cannabinoids for pain or anything else, in this country, we're light years behind. Safety, adverse effects, side effects. You control the drug to placebo. You decide whether, if a patient falls and breaks their leg, was it because of the drug or was it something else? You know, they slipped on a banana peel. You have to know whether it was bad enough that the patient stopped the drug because of it, and you have to decide whether the side effect or the disease is worse. There are many drugs that get approved these days where it isn't such a great balance there. And again, accessibility has three factors. Most people want a drug that's legal, keeps them out of the jail. It has to be available, and for a lot of people that only means prescription drugs, and it has to be affordable. That means $1 sign, not $4 signs. And finally, I hope in this brief demonstration you understand that cannabis-based medicines can be FDA approved as pharmaceuticals, given enough time, money, and effort. It's also important that you understand that one preparation is not like another. If Sativex gets approved, it doesn't mean anything about the future scheduling of other forms of cannabis. And the next person down the road is going to have to prove safety and efficacy just the same for their preparation because they're not biochemically equivalent. To do that, to be a generic Sativex, you'd have to match all the little peaks on that fingerprint, and that's just not possible at all. Importantly, when Sativex or another cannabis-based medicine is approved, it'll be in Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 or something else. But that, again, does not have any impact on the scheduling of cannabis itself, which will remain in Schedule 1 until something changes that. So I see a lot of frowns in the audience, but I'd have you keep smiling. There are other paths to the goal of optimized endocannabinoid system health. So hopefully more on that in the future.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Steenstra, president of Vote Hemp. I'm hoping, Jeff, you can pull up my presentation there. Perfect. All right, it's nice to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about hemp. I know you guys have been talking a lot about medical cannabis, and there's definitely some crossover here, but just give you a little update on the state and federal laws and some of the regulatory situation with industrial hemp. So 2014 was a real big breakthrough year for the hemp industry. The situation since 1970, hemp has been considered to be marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act, and the only way you could grow it was with a license from the DEA, and they weren't giving those out for the most part. So in the last Farm Bill, there was an opportunity. Representative Polis was able to put an amendment in, and it passed in the House 225 to 200, and it added a provision into the House version of the Farm Bill. And when it ultimately got through conference, there was some tweaking to the language, but ultimately there was language in there that allows for research and pilot programs to be conducted by universities and state departments of agriculture. So that part of the law is called Section 7606. The Farm Bill is a 5-year piece, so they only do this once every 5 years, so it's good for the next 5 years. And we're hoping before the next one comes out, we'll be able to take it to the next step. But in any case, if you want to look it up, that's Section 7606 of the Farm Bill. And essentially, it also defined industrial hemp as distinct, but only in the specific scenario where you're growing it as a university or a Department of Ag. So after that passed, farmers in a couple of states were actually able to get it together quickly enough to grow some hemp. So in Kentucky and Colorado and Vermont, we had some very limited acreage. I would say Kentucky is the most friendly and regulatory environment right now for industrial hemp, where the Department of Ag has been very aggressive in promoting working directly with farmers and helping them, enabling them to be able to grow the crop. So when the Farm Bill passed in February of 2014, there were 10 states that were able to take advantage of the provisions of that. And the passage of the hemp amendment to the Farm Bill created quite a bit of excitement. And we had 12 additional states that passed laws during 2014, so they could also take advantage of it. So there's now 22 total. And that has been continuing. So this year, we've already had 19 different states, including a few that already had laws that are trying to tweak them, that introduced more legislation. So there's been a lot of activity as a result of that. So there is legislation pending in the Congress, was introduced in January and February that would, it's called the Industrial Hemp Farming Act of 2015, and that would define hemp and explicitly allow states to regulate it, not just for research or pilot programs, but for commercial hemp farming. And we've been working hard to try to get that passed as well. So that would define industrial hemp. Well, this is, oh, sorry, this is the, this one actually says authorized pilot programs, but that's incorrect. So it would actually authorize states to regulate hemp fully. And so the HR 525 is the House version of the bill. And we currently have 54 co-sponsors. We've had pretty good bipartisan support on that. There's about 20 Republicans and 35 Democrats. And then S-134 is the Senate version. That is sponsored by Senator Wyden and has 6 co-sponsors, including 4 Republicans. They're all listed there. We've been very fortunate to have the Kentucky coming on board with this, and the situation in Kentucky has pushed a lot of their delegation on board as well, and so Senator McConnell's been a supporter and been fortunate to have his help. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about regulations in the hemp industry, specifically with regards to consumables, because that's a lot of what we're talking about here. And so the hemp industry, a lot of the products that you know may have seen in your local co-op or Whole Foods market, you know, these products have had to go through a whole process in order to get into a store like that. The manufacturers have to meet good manufacturing practice standards and do labeling, correct labeling, and other things to ensure that these products are safe for consumers before a retailer is going to put those on the shelf. And so the hemp industry went through a process. You know, the foods have started maybe 25 years ago. Went through a process to get those foods up to standard where they could start to be carried into these mainstream stores. But essentially, you're looking at FDA regulations, whether it's regard to dietary supplements or foods. They have good manufacturing practices, as an example. So the fact that the companies were mandated to do this sort of as a way to access the market, I think was a good learning process for a lot of companies as they grew. A lot of the companies started out very small and have grown and learned all this process. But I think it's a good model to look at for all parts of all type of consumable cannabis products, because ultimately what you want to do is you want to try to self-regulate, you want to try to anticipate, and you don't want to have to wait until there's a problem and have somebody come in and deal with it later. So I would also mention specifically on health claims, that's a big area for FDA where they take a careful look. So you have to be really careful when you're putting a product out there. If you're making health claims that aren't approved by the FDA. So FDA's primary goal is just to ensure that foods and dietary supplements are manufactured in a consistent way and with accurate labeling, just to make sure that they're safe for consumers. And so that's a big thing I think that everyone in cannabis is going to want to look at for their products. And let's see here. One other thing that the hemp industry had to deal with is the unfortunate area of drug testing. The reality is that hemp foods do contain some small amounts of THC, or the hemp seeds would have THC on the coating of the shell. And so that could potentially get into the foods. And because there's many people that are mandated to take drug testing through their work, we had to be able to ensure those people that they weren't going to consume hemp granola for breakfast and hemp oil in their salad and then find out that they tested positive and lose their job. So one thing that's important too is just if you're putting a product out there, to be transparent and let you know if there is THC in it, to let people know, so that if somebody has a concern about that from a drug testing standpoint, they have the opportunity to be aware of what your product is. The industry created a test pledge program, and the standards for hemp foods are 5 ppm for hemp seed oil, and 5 parts per million, that is, and 1.5 ppm for hemp nut or shelled hemp seed. And essentially that there was a science-based published peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology that backed up those numbers. So it's worked well for the industry, and it's been all voluntary, but virtually everyone in the industry is complying with that. So it's unfortunate that there are so many people that are actually forced to take drug testing, but I saw some stats that said over 400,000 government employees are currently subject to drug testing, primarily in transportation and national security. And then you've got lots of other people at private employers are still doing drug testing. So, all right. So and then I just wanted to also highlight, and this probably has been brought up already, but that we were excited to be working with ASA and APA on a joint statement that was just put out this past week. And just highlighting a couple of the main points here. You know, just encouraging all the manufacturers to go for safe production processes for product development for any products of human consumption, and disclosure of testing results with regards to contaminants or pesticides, accurate labeling, and that also explicitly lists cannabis content and the plant part that it comes from, and then disclosures that inform consumers about the product potency and or dosage. So I hope everybody's checked that out. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I might try to keep this closer to me since I'm going to have to do this a lot in a minute. I was asked to give a discussion on herbal medicines, but as Ethan said, there are 2, so thank you very much. There are actually 8. There are the 2 approved drugs that Ethan mentioned, and there are 6 over-the-counter monographs that allow herbs to be included. So we're allowed to sell psyllium as an over-the-counter bulk laxative, senna as an over-the-counter stimulant laxative, slipperium as an over-the-counter demulcent, menthol as an over-the-counter, I think it's for coughs, guar gum, I'm not sure what the indication is, and capsaicin for over-the-counter topical relief of rheumatic pain and arthritic pain. So those are your 2 drug options if you wanted to get your cannabis into a drug category, but you don't, because that prescription drug category, the route that GW is taking, that's the millions of dollars, or is it tens of millions of dollars? And the OTC route, it's really, the door is closed. The Food and Drug Administration says that all you need to do is petition to get a new substance added to an existing monograph. The last time they did that was 1991 when they put slippery elm back in. In 1972, there were about 200 herbs included in monograph, but they've stripped them all out. So those are dead ends. Those are not places that we're going. I'll repeat what Ethan said. What we're going to be talking about here is the way it is rather than the way I want it to be. But as such, what do I do here? I go. These are the issues that if you wanted to market your cannabis product as a dietary supplement, these are the various things that you'd have to deal with. I'm not sure it's a great idea to deliberately market your products as dietary supplements, but the Food and Drug Administration thinks that's what you're doing as soon as you put them in a health food store, as soon as you sell them on the internet, whether or not you have the word supplement, whether or not you have supplement facts. We can see there, and I'll touch on this, those warning letters that went on a few weeks ago. They think you're selling dietary supplements, so you ought to be thinking about all of these. The first one's simple. You go to FDA's website, you register as a food facility. It's free. It should take about 20 minutes. But it puts you on the radar. They now know where you are. And you have to tell them what kind of product you're selling, a dietary supplement. I'm going to get into some details on the ingredients that we're allowed to use. That's mostly good news because clearly cannabis can be included just based on the definitions. The forms, which are fairly limited. I'm going to talk a little about new dietary ingredients and ask the question as to whether or not cannabis-derived ingredients are new under the law. Look a little at claims, and the Food and Drug Administration thinks you make a claim whether it's on your package, your labeling, the brochures, or your website, or your customers posting on your Facebook page. That's all your claims. You own all of those. We're going to look a little at good manufacturing practice, mostly to draw you back to the work that we've been doing. And then adverse event reporting, I know Tony Young talked about this yesterday. This is just here as a placeholder. It's required for dietary supplements. We have a really good program at APA to guide people through that. But it's something that we all need to be thinking about and not be fearful of. The reporting of an adverse event to the Food and Drug Administration is never an admission or even an indication of evidence that the product taken caused the effect, only that there's a temporal relationship. And this is true for the 400,000 serious adverse events reported each year to the Food and Drug Administration for prescription drugs. None of those prove the drug did that. They're signal generators. So let me move into ingredients and forms and what's allowed. And I've bolded here the words that matter. This is from the law. Dietary supplements can include herbs or other botanicals except tobacco. No other exception. No other exception. Now, if the Congress had in October of 1994, if somebody said, what about cannabis? But nobody did, because nobody was thinking about it. We are not excluded to sell the herbs or the concentrates, metabolites, constituents, extracts. We can sell all of these things as dietary supplements. And even if a drug company got out there before us, that's what the first paragraph says, we can sell it. So if we're already in the marketplace with our chamomile and Merck comes up with an amazing chamomile drug, they don't get chamomile, we still can sell chamomile. The same thing is true with cannabis. But here's what the other one says. If they're out there first, we can't go there. So this is a question that we really need to think about. There are some drugs, some cannabis-derived drugs. There are some INDs, and this, if they have even gotten the investigational new drug approval through FDA and publicly announced that, then we can't sell that. So I understand there is one for cannabidiol. I'm not sure exactly what the specific description of the ingredient for which there's an IND is, but of course we'll say ours is completely different than that, right? What we sell is completely different than that. And I want to remember that because you'll see a couple other places here where we're going to try to say ours is exactly the same as that, so. And these are just some examples of, yes, when the law was passed, only tobacco was out. Since then, FDA said we don't want you selling apricot seeds. They contain Laetrile, which is a drug. We don't want you selling phytolactolectins. Thank you very much, Food and Drug Administration. This was a new dietary ingredient notification. Somebody said they'd like to bring that to the market, and FDA said you shall not. Aristolochiaceae, they all contain aristolochic acid, which was used in traditional medicine. These herbs were used in traditional medicine in China for 1,000 years probably, and in the mid 80s or late 80s, early 90s, through misuse of some of these herbs by medical doctors who applied use of these herbs for weight loss where there's no history. They ended up doing serious kidney harm. And now aristolochic acid containing herbs are banned pretty much throughout the world. They're not used in China or Japan anymore. FDA has made it clear they don't want us selling comfrey or other herbs that contain toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And then, as Tony Young mentioned yesterday, we lost ephedra. The actual ban is on ephedrine. We could still sell Mormon tea, the wild ephedra that grows in Utah, but it doesn't have the same, it doesn't have ephedrine alkaloids, so it doesn't work as a bronchodilator or as a stimulant. Those are all out now. Red yeast rice, Tony talked about yesterday. It's a perfectly safe ingredient, and if you want to sell what FDA has called food red yeast rice, go ahead, but as soon as you start to standardize it to the lovastatin level, you can't sell it. And this is an example of, that's because there was already a drug in the marketplace. And again, Tony got into this yesterday. FDA didn't say it's not safe. They just said there's prior ownership. Essentially, there's prior ownership of that ingredient. And again, this has potential relevance in with our ingredient. This pyridoxamine is not allowed, and this one, the FDA's rationale was exactly the same. Somebody had an IND for it before it came to market. We're not allowed to sell that. And homotaurine, this one is not really relevant here. The law allows us to sell amino acids. That's what the Congress said, amino acids. FDA said, well, not that kind of amino acids, so they took this one off the market. The forms are really limited. They all go in your mouth. Sprays are questionable. The lawyers now tell you if you're using a spray, for your instructions to say spray into the mouth and swallow so that it is for ingestion. But anything for external use, topicals, those are not allowed. It's really only for oral ingestion, and these are some specific forms that are allowed. It's a pretty broad tolerance as long as you're putting it in, as long as it's for oral use. I'm going to move on then to the next subject, which is new dietary ingredients. And the law is pretty straightforward. A new dietary ingredient is simply one that was not in the market the day the law was passed. So if it was in the market, we refer to those as ODIs, old dietary ingredients. That term's not in the law, but we just use that term. And if they're new, then they're new dietary ingredients. And if you bring a new ingredient to market, then a notification is required, and I'll get to the asterisk on the next page because there are some exceptions. You have to file a notice with the Food and Drug Administration. You have to tell them what your ingredient is. You have to tell them who you are. You have to tell them the level of use, how many milligrams, how many times a day, or there's populations who are going to be excluded, what kind of warnings are appropriate. And you have to provide the evidence that is the basis for your determination that the product that contains the ingredient will be safe, not FDA's determination, the submitter's determination. And approval is not required. So if FDA says, well, we don't agree, you can go to market in 76 days. Now you have to think about your liability. Do you want to go to market in 76 days when there's a publicly available record, which is a document on FDA stationery that says the Food and Drug Administration isn't sure your ingredient is safe? Most companies go back and try again and go back and try again and see if they can't get the other letter where FDA accepts the submission. The place where we acknowledge it's a new dietary ingredient, but we're not required to file a notification. If it's new, but it's an article used for food in a form in which the food has not been chemically altered, and this other language here is what does chemically altered mean. So again, if we go look at cannabis, do we have good evidence of the use of cannabis as a food? Absolutely. For cannabis flowers, for cooked cannabis in various forms, for teas, for brownies, for, you all know these things better than I do, you know, a lot of food forms. So certainly that cannabis would be allowed or would be considered possibly new as a dietary ingredient, but not subject to notification. You can go to market. Now, whether FDA is ever going to say that, you know, they wouldn't just say it freely, and we probably wouldn't want to ask them to say that. If you don't comply, your food's adulterated. This is just straightforward. If you didn't file that 75-day notice, then you've got an adulterated food that's subject to immediate seizure and withdrawal. I'm not going to really get into this except to say it's not overly complicated. I don't mean to make it sound overly simple. These 5 steps, that's all that's in the regulation. There's these 2 that they forgot to put in the regulation to tell you that you actually have to describe the new dietary ingredient, and that if it's a botanical, you have to tell them the part of the plant. It took us a while to get to that too, though, so maybe we'll be a little forgiving. But it's both straightforward and it's somewhat complicated. It really requires a scientific basis and a legal understanding. Now, this is what we always advise people. You need a lawyer and you need a toxicologist, and you're probably going to spend somewhere $20,000 to $30,000 minimum, and the toxicologist consultants rush the stage when I say that and say, don't say that, it's 100,000. But I think you can do this affordably. Cannabis might be a pretty tough one to do, but I do know that there are companies and attorneys who are looking at this, and they're looking at it carefully. When you file a notification, FDA doesn't say approve, not approve. They send you a letter that says, thank you very much, we got it, or we call that filing, or they object. Not a word that they use. The words they use are the agency has serious concerns about your information. And then they tell you what that is. And as I said earlier, you can then go back and say, well, let me address those concerns with a refiling. And they usually, these are the reasons they would object. They either say we don't think it's safe. They don't do that very often. I'm going to give you the examples. They say it's not actually a dietary ingredient. Or they say you didn't follow the regulation. That's what 196 is. Or they say you did all of that, but it's just not enough information. We don't agree you can draw a conclusion of safety based on that information. With regard to, these are the 5 times that they've said that's not a dietary, or actually, this is certainly not safe. I already mentioned the phytolactolectins. The GBL, what is that? It's a cleaning solvent. It's good for buffing up your chrome. Somebody wanted to put it in a dietary supplement. Thank you, Food and Drug Administration. Oleander extract. Thank you, Food and Drug Administration. I mean, 2 kids died in Los Angeles, where I live. I think this was in 2000. Oleander's beautiful. It grows fast, long, straight stems. 2 brothers shoved oleander stems through their hot dogs, roasted them, ate them, and died. So it's a highly toxic plant. Pyrrolizidine alkaloid containing seed oil. Again, what FDA said is you're going to have to show us that you got the PAs out. Maybe this has some traditional use. Maybe you're convinced that it's therapeutically valuable or provides some health benefits. We don't actually say therapeutic. But you got to get the PAs out. You have to address the toxicity concerns. And then germanium, which is a highly toxic substance, and I can't believe that somebody thought that FDA would say that was okay. And then these are reasons that they say it didn't meet the definition. I love this one, human placenta. FDA said, let's see, that's not an amino acid, it's not a vitamin, it's not a mineral, it's not an herb. That's the main complaint that FDA issues. And then sometimes they say, well, you told us that some tribesmen used this when they were starving for up to 3 days, and that it was a tribe of 14 people. What's that got to do with your supercritical extract concentrated to 40% of one constituent that you're going to tell people to use twice daily? Not a crazy objection. But this is the question for us. Is every extract or concentrate, right? These are the kinds of ingredients we're allowed to sell. We're allowed to sell herbs and other botanicals or extracts or concentrates. So is every extract or concentrate of an old dietary ingredient also an old dietary ingredient? These are comments that APA made, and it's comments submitted to the Food and Drug Administration on guidance that FDA issued in 2011 that was a really terrible product from the agency, and we had hundreds of concerns about it, but these were the ones that are really relevant. What we said is, if you've got an old, this is to paraphrase that first sentence, if you've got an old ingredient and you make a product by a traditional food manufacturing step, that's an old ingredient. If you make soup out of it, if you make tea out of it, if you make a tincture, if you make an oil, if you dry it, if you cut it, if you pickle it, we think those are all old. Don't make us go prove that I have pickled capers. If capers are old, then pickled, what we said is any traditional food processing of an old ingredient should be treated as an old ingredient. And then we were rather careful to not say the opposite is true, but we got pretty close, and what we said is that, where does this start? A dietary ingredient is prepared by non-traditional food preparation processes may be an NDI, but if it is chemically identical, indistinguishable from one that's made by a traditional food processing step, then we think it still should be treated as old. But we did leave a place here that there's an assumption that there's something that you could do with an old ingredient, an old botanical source material that by the time you're finished, your product is can no longer completely rely on the safety record of your starting material. That's really the question that we have to ask ourselves. And you see in the marketplace, very few companies that market and say, just like everybody else's. They say exactly the opposite. Really unique, nobody else thought of this, mine is extra special, nobody else has done this before, completely new. Well, those are all new dietary ingredient statements, that if this is a dietary ingredient, those are the companies that really need to be thinking about whether or not this NDI route is something they need to follow. Let me just jump into claims. I think I've only got a slide or two here. And mostly, this is what we're allowed to make, these statements of nutritional support. So we could say that, this cannabis product supports general well-being or promotes healthy digestion. What we can't make are drug claims. If we make, even when we make those soft claims, the manufacturer has to have substantiation. We have to put this disclaimer, and we have to tell FDA we're doing this. I see a lot of cannabis products, they've got the disclaimer, but I don't know that they're also given these 30-day notices to FDA. I don't know that they're food facility registrants. I do sometimes wonder, as soon as you put this on your label, you're declaring your product to be a dietary supplement. And that's how the FDA is going to treat you. Although, as I said earlier, I think they're going to do that anyway. I think that's what they think we're selling. This is what we're not allowed to say. If it claims to diagnose, mitigate, treat, cure, or prevent any specific disease or class of diseases, even if it's true, even if it's substantiated, that's illegal for a dietary supplement. Go see CDER. Go see the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. That's what FDA would say. So FDA issued these warning letters. A lot of us saw these on February 26th to 6 marketers of CBD products. And all of the claims were found on websites. FDA didn't have to leave their office. Most of them said studies have shown, my guess is the people that made these claims didn't think they were making any claims. They were telling the truth. Some studies have shown these things. That's a drug claim in FDA's mind. Here are examples of all of these things that studies have shown that my CBD product is good for psychosis, for neurodegenerative disorders, for anti-tumoral effects, for depression, for cancer. Cancer was on almost every one of the letters. It's an antipsychotic, these are all drug claims. And that's what FDA said, stop making your drug claims. I found this remarkable. FDA tested them. They said, we didn't even find CBD in some of these products. They had, I think there were 6 companies, about 25 products, and 7 or 8 of them, no detection of CBDs. What was remarkable to those of us that follow the law was what FDA did not say. They did not say CBD is illegal in a dietary supplement. They did not say, even if it were legal, it's a new dietary ingredient. Remarkable. I think now, and then the next sentence after we all issued emails to each other, remarkable, the next email was, don't take that for permission. FDA did not just say, your CBD is perfectly legal to sell and is old. And I know that's, get the cork back in the champagne. So CGMP, I've got this one slide. It's a big, complicated rule. It doesn't work very well. It's a poorly written rule by the Food and Drug Administration. I say that to them, too. I'm okay about being recorded saying that. And it was the primary reference that we used to create our recommendations for regulators on cannabis manufacturing, packaging, labeling, and holding operations, one of our 4 documents. But we've made it a lot better. We've improved it, and we've already told FDA we're going to come back to them and make suggestions on how they could clean up 21 CFR 111 to make it more easy to understand. Here's one of the, these are the key CGMP issues, no matter what your CGMP is. Basic cleanliness and facility design, adequate training and documentation of training, setting and meeting specifications for identity, purity, strength, and composition. Here's one big difference between FDA's CGMP rule for supplements. They don't define any of these 4 words. They just say you have to meet them. We defined them. Makes it a whole lot easier to know whether or not you're meeting the rule. It requires lots of written procedures and written records throughout all operations. We think that's good. We think it really helps the companies know that they're doing the right thing, and it really helps the inspector. A lot of what happens with any CGMP is the truly qualified and highly trained people are those who are making the product, and this is not meant as an insult in any manner, but of course the inspector doesn't have that expertise. That's not what they do all day. They inspect. But to some degree, the written records are the communication between those parties. So we're really supportive of. It's tedious, but we think it's an important part of any CGMP. Specific to cannabis, things that we added in our recommendations were acquisition and distribution to comply with applicable legislation and regulations. We're using a substance that's not legal federally and is only legal in some states. So we just put this language in here that said you need to have controls over your raw material. And also the same thing on inventory and disposal record keeping. It's relevant to this particular ingredient. And, see this button? I want to thank all these people. You've met Jane Wilson and Tammy Wall if you've been around our cannabis work, and they're both here, and the work that they do supports getting all of this work done. Tim Smale, the chair of our APA Cannabis Committee, and of course Tony Young, our general counsel, who gave that sparkling presentation yesterday. I thank you all for your time.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Piper from the Drug Policy Alliance. I'm going to talk a little bit about regulating marijuana like alcohol, and I'm going to try to be very brief so that we can get to the questions and answers, because I'm very interested in actually getting people's feedback and ideas. So 4 states have legalized marijuana like alcohol. Washington, I don't have a presentation. Washington, Colorado, Oregon, and Alaska, with, I think as most people know, Colorado and Washington being up and running, and Alaska and Oregon in the process of getting up and running. And when I say regulate marijuana like alcohol, I mean regulating the production and distribution of marijuana. So that's licensing, that's taxing, that's labeling, that's age control. It's pretty much all the regulations that usually come with medical marijuana at the state level, only this is for non-medical use. But it's important, I think, to point out that there's 2 contextual differences when it comes to regulating marijuana like alcohol. One, alcohol has been regulated in the context of alcohol being legal at the federal level in all 50 states, whereas marijuana is still illegal federally and entirely illegal in 15 states, and then partially legal in the rest of the states, and most of the states banned for medical use, and then the 4 other states. And so this is a very interesting context to try to regulate something. If you look at the repeal of alcohol prohibition, it happened relatively quickly. States said we're no longer going to enforce alcohol. Enforcement, the feds realized that they really didn't have much of a choice, so they repealed federal prohibition. And then about 9 months later, they decided to come back in and set up kind of a federal regulatory structure. And then the key part of repealing alcohol prohibition, which still lasts to this day, is each state can set its own alcohol policy. And if a state wanted to, they could outlaw alcohol outright. And a number of states kept alcohol illegal up until the 60s. And I think Kansas, up until the 80s, still had liquor illegal. You could buy beer and wine, you just couldn't buy liquor in the state. But for the most part, alcohol prohibition came crashing down relatively quickly. And obviously we're all working as quickly as possible to bring down marijuana prohibition at the federal level, but we're in a weird moment in time in which some states are moving forward regulating marijuana, but the feds are still somewhat standing in the way, but at the same time have, for the most part, decided to let states go about their own business. And that kind of has some pluses and some minuses to it. I think the minuses are relatively easy to understand. I think people have talked about the problems with testing, like genuine testing, which is going to be really hard to do in the context of federal prohibition. Interstate commerce obviously is still illegal, which has both the kind of the negative side that you can't legally move things across state lines, but also has somewhat of a positive sign, and that during the repeal of alcohol prohibition, the policymakers at the local, state, and federal level were very, very interested in getting organized crime out of the business as quickly as possible, and arguably went really, really overboard with their regulations, with their taxes and their licensing and the three-tier system. And as a result, America had to suffer through decades of drinking shitty beer manufactured by very large companies. And it wasn't until relatively recently when alcohol manufacturing was deregulated federally and then also deregulated to state level. Even here in DC, we're going through a renaissance. For those who are in DC, check out some of our breweries and some of our distilleries. They're pretty awesome and they're relatively new. Like 10 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to have any of that in DC, and DC's relaxed some of its alcohol rules. The downside of federal prohibition, obviously, is a lack of regulation, but there is that positive side, I suppose, that we have this brief window in time in which, mom and pop operations stand a chance, which gets me to, I guess, my final point. We're supposed to talk about regulating marijuana like alcohol. And when people talk about regulations and regulating alcohol and regulating marijuana, they usually talk in the context of public health and public safety. And those are very good contexts to be regulating marijuana. And indeed, that's the context in which we regulate alcohol. But I think a strong case can be made that marijuana is fundamentally different. In that we've had decades of very, very punitive marijuana policies that have resulted in tens of millions of lives being destroyed and families torn apart with a very racially disparate impact. And I think if we're going to talk about regulating marijuana like alcohol in the context of public safety and public health, we should also talk about regulating marijuana in a context of racial justice and social justice. And what all that means. And I don't really have all the answers, but I think a good starting point is, it's not just enough to say, let's establish age controls and let's deal with labeling, let's deal with content control. We really do need to get policymakers to start thinking, what does it mean to regulate marijuana in a racial justice, social justice context? And I think there's some bare minimum things that we can do. One, at the very least, let's stop discriminating against people with convictions. I think that's the first start. We need to think about what to do with the tax revenue. In DC, we're trying to legalize, we've legalized possession and grow your own. We're trying to set up a regulatory structure. We're probably going to do it. Congress is kind of in a way where we're going to get around them. We're going to do it with or without Congress. It doesn't really matter. But I've been very heartened by the conversation here in DC about what to do with the tax revenue. And people are talking about, let's rebuild the communities that have been destroyed by decades of the drug war. And that's not just education. That's not just drug treatment. That's reentry programs. That is jobs programs. And that's really taken seriously, this idea that we've destroyed entire communities. And so let's use some of that tax revenue to rebuild those communities. But it's also worth thinking about how we're licensing and how we're setting up the system of distribution. And I'll just say two things here. One thing is the fewer licenses you have, whether that's for manufacturing, distributing, or selling, the less likely it is that the people most impacted by the drug war are going to get those licenses, because those first 5 licenses are going to go to the people with the best lobbyists and the best lawyers. So our best chance, really, of helping people is maybe there should be 10 licenses, or 15, or 25, or 50, or 100, or maybe everyone gets a license. That would be great. Maryland has an interesting part of their medical marijuana program, which strongly encourages the regulatory body to take into account whether or not a business is minority-owned or not. I think that's something to think about. We've been talking in DC about requiring businesses that apply for a license to demonstrate they have some connection to the community, that they have a plan to give back to the community, that they have a plan to hire people with convictions, and that in particular, they're going to make sure that their business is very diverse. Because if I could just recommend, I think, one book, many of you may have already read this book, but if you haven't, I highly recommend reading Michelle Alexander's A New Jim Crow, because she really gets into detail on the need to take into account what decades of punitive criminal justice policies have caused. And she has recently talked about the juxtaposition that is occurring in a number of states in which you essentially have white, affluent venture capitalists getting rich off doing what black and brown people not only have gone to jail for, but are actually still in jail for. And I'm going to say, and I'll just end with this, that it's obviously very easy for me to stand up here, or for anyone really to get up and talk about fixing some of these issues, because we are it is so hard as it is just to end marijuana prohibition. I mean, just medical marijuana alone has been, an enormous struggle that is nowhere near over, obviously. To go that next step and end marijuana prohibition outright is a huge, huge, huge lift. But I don't want to be here 20 years from now, looking back, excited that we ended marijuana prohibition, but looking at what that industry looks like and being disappointed that I didn't do more for social justice and racial justice. And so I'm very interested in this idea of all of us thinking through, as we're writing laws and as we're regulating marijuana like alcohol, how can we do it in a way that's not just good for public health and public safety, but also for racial justice and social justice, and just to constantly raise that question in every context, in the context of licensing, in the context of taxation, in the context of, we don't want to create a system in which some people, are allowed to do certain things while others continue to be arrested. And I think there's a very real danger that we're going to set up a two-tier system. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm actually not going to go too much more into this because I think this is what we've been talking about for 2 days. So I think you guys have a sense that of how medical cannabis is being regulated in the United States. But what this sort of panel represents for medical cannabis, for the industry, for the movement, for the patients, is that I literally have been going like this. Do we want to be here? No. Do we want to? No. Or do we almost want to be here, but we're not going to have our medicine covered by insurance? So do we go back over here, right? Same thing, we're like, well, maybe, people always said if you legalize cannabis for everybody, then you're not going to need medical cannabis. So that's not quite true. So you can see the conversation that we're in right now is that we're somewhere here, right? And I wish the truth was that I was right in the middle, but that's not actually the way that this works, right? We're seeing different pieces of this move forward. And so I actually wanted to turn the end of this panel into more of a conversation, which, all of you have been here this weekend, have seen sort of and hear, from sometimes panicky emails from me about what we should be doing next. But I just wanted to ask, what do you see as our biggest challenge is moving forward from here, right? Like, let's say that Tuesday, all the people here, we're going to be lobbying on the Careers Act. We're going to change the scheduling of marijuana. We are going to give the states the ability to regulate medical cannabis but still, not all of our questions are going to be answered. So within that context, I just want to, to share with our conference, what do you think our biggest challenges are, and we can just pass it down.
I'm going to stand, otherwise you can't see me. This leads into another point I wanted to make. I think the biggest problem is scheduling. An example of that is that for botanicals, as we've heard, there are processes for getting them out there to the market. There is a hooker in all this, in that if your plant is Schedule I, as cannabis is, the FDA sort of assumes that they have jurisdiction over it. And right now, the only path to market is really through the FDA process. Okay, now that's certainly going to apply to THC until or unless it's rescheduled. That's a big ask for a lot of people that would be involved in the decision. However, there are 99 other cannabinoids in cannabis, including cannabidiol, that are there basically through guilt by association. It may interest you to know that cannabidiol is not a scheduled substance in Canada or in most countries in the world. So one of the first orders of business may be to try to reschedule other cannabinoids and at least be able to bring hemp-based products to the market through these other avenues. So I think that some effort should be applied there.
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge facing the industry going forward, we've got to get federal legislation passed on all aspects of reform, and so building a strong base of support in Congress is a long and challenging process. And I look out at the bills that I've seen for cannabis reform, and there's quite a few actually. I think I saw about 8 of them in the House. There's one in the Senate, and I just noticed, I don't know if anybody had picked up, but Senator Hatch actually just put in a bill, or not a bill, but maybe an amendment in any case, that relates to concerns about edibles and children accessing edibles, cannabis edibles. And so, but there didn't seem to be, there's a lot of people trying different things, and there isn't a broad base of support on any of those. I think the most co-sponsors I saw on any of the bills was about 15. And so I think, I know there's some good people that are working on this. I know Mike Correa and Don Murphy and some others, up on the Hill, but I think this industry is really going to have to do a lot of outreach in Congress. And I found for us in the hemp world was that our work in the states often led to progress in Congress, because a lot of these state legislators start out learning about various topics when they're at the state level, where it's a lot less threatening. And if you can educate them there prior to coming to Congress, you've got a lot better shot, I think, of having them come in with the right mindset. So obviously there's tons of things that are happening at the state level, but I'm surprised that we haven't seen more support yet in Congress yet, for this issue, for reform generally. So I'd say that's one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I think I'd start with the biggest challenge is the one that Ethan named. It's the fact that we've got a Schedule I substance that needs to be taken care of. And if what we're talking about are all of the articles of commerce derived from cannabis, which are many, we're okay with the rope and the T-shirts, and we're okay with the food oils. And I will always give thanks and appreciation to HIA for taking the lead on that. They did it 15 years ago, and it stands. So we've got those articles. That's great. We've got this other subclass of articles coming in, the CBD products that are low in THC. I do think that the dietary supplement route for those products should work. I deliberately pointed out some of the concerns, and we're going to have quiet conversations with FDA. Are they going to trap us as soon as we go in and try to comply with the NDI notifications? If so, then they're shutting that route. We're not. But that still leaves the THC cannabis products, which are incredibly important. And I think for the biggest challenge there is the language of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that defines a drug as any substance the intended use of which is to cure, treat, prevent, or mitigate a disease. That's an untouchable sentence in a law that was passed in 1938, and we need to touch it. We need to change that so that this article at least, we're allowed to tell the truth about what its therapeutic value is. I just think that's another significant issue of what we're talking about is reclaiming this entire plant and all of the articles that we have the right to use. You know, we own this plant. The federal government doesn't own this plant. And I also just want to comment on one of the things that Bill said, and the whole social justice thing. As far as I know, the state of California doesn't limit the number of plumbers that are licensed, so I don't know why we would limit the number of people who can sell cannabis. If there's make it about business. You get a supply-demand equation, and whoever can do well will do well, is what I'd like to see as another challenge that I hadn't thought of until Bill mentioned it.
I think one of the biggest challenges is going to be protecting state medical marijuana programs. And I mean that in two ways. One way is, I think there's a danger that when Congress gets around to doing something on medical marijuana, it's going to be something like rescheduling or removing barriers to research or something that's good, but isn't really going to help patients, certainly not in the short term. And so I worry that Congress is going to reschedule marijuana, or the Obama administration will reschedule it, and people will say, okay, we're done on this issue. It's really, really critical. I think the most important part of the CARES Act actually is the part that says if you're following your state medical marijuana law, you're exempt from the Controlled Substances Act. And that is something that we can't give up ever, that we have to protect these state programs. And then I mean it in the second sense that as more and more states move towards, and I meant to say this in my introduction, as more states move towards regulating marijuana like alcohol, they're going to realize relatively quickly, and they already are, that it's hard to collect tax revenue, and it's hard to regulate something if you've got more than one system. And so there's going to be a temptation to either get rid of medical marijuana or to absorb it somehow into the non-medical marijuana program. And just, I think it's incumbent upon us all to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so keeping medical marijuana completely separate and protecting it both from legalization, but also arguably more important, I think, from Congress. Even some of our allies in Congress, I think, don't quite understand what is at stake here and would easily sell out the medical marijuana programs for something like rescheduling, which they think is a solution when it's arguably not.
And then I was also just wondering if you guys have any questions for each other. I know I talk to each of you all of the time, but this is sort of the interesting, points of this different perspective. So I just wanted to give people an opportunity. Yeah.
I'm curious what everyone thinks about. We were talking about rescheduling here, and to me, it seems like the rescheduling process is broken. And there's been, I believe, 3 attempts to reschedule marijuana over the last 40 years, and none of them is successful. And I recall Judge Young's, eloquent statement about, one of the safest therapeutic substances known to man, and yet somehow it hasn't changed. And so I wonder, Congress kind of created this mess when they stuck, marijuana in Schedule I. Does it get fixed if we, the CARES Act moves marijuana to Schedule II, or what if you move it to a lower schedule? How do we get there? Is there any other way other than Congress to do that? And does it really fix everything? So I don't know if he wants to.
Yeah, we did have some speakers this weekend that were addressing that. But yes, I mean, at this point, the clearest avenue for rescheduling, descheduling, moving that anywhere is going to be Congress. I don't know if you guys have any. Yeah, please.
That in of itself is tough, but I'm going to suggest something that's even tougher, which is completely undoing our scheduling system. I mean, even if it was easy to reschedule marijuana to where it should be, like there's no place in the schedule for a drug that has no medical use, but also at the same time has low potential for abuse. That just doesn't exist. Where do you put a drug like that? And why are alcohol and tobacco not scheduled? And so I'd like to see a scheduling system that is based on the relative harms of the drugs compared to the relative benefits, and the benefits not just being medical, but there's a whole range of, obviously personal, religious benefits that people derive from drugs. And that's a much longer term conversation, but it's worth having because the scheduling system is broken. But even if we could tweak it, but let's not tweak it, let's just completely redesign it.
Yeah, and I think I'm saying somewhat the same thing, and maybe it's completely naive. Deschedule is what we want. It ought to be scheduled exactly the same way as echinacea, you know?
And for people who don't work, with other patient advocacy organizations, the scheduling of marijuana is not the only time we hear about scheduling and rescheduling of drugs. The schedule classification has a lot of impacts, even when you're talking about prescription drugs. If something is a Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, it affects whether or not insurance companies will cover payments of those. It affects whether or not a doctor is even willing to recommend a medication. And so the overhaul of the system, so to speak, actually has a larger implication than just cannabis. And I think what we're learning working with great organizations like Epilepsy Foundation, that a majority of what patient advocacy organizations are doing in DC is dealing with that system. So I think, Bill, I would love to, maybe put together a panel to talk about how we can present something to Congress that is, let's get rid of a broken system altogether.
Well, I'll drink to that. Yeah.
In like 5 minutes.
Well, I'm not sure I have more to add to that. Could I shift over and ask Michael a question? It would be, what would you suggest as a straight-ahead strategy from your standpoint to leverage the system as it currently exists?
Setup question.
Which system? To get cannabis products on the shelf. Again, I break it down into which product. The plant produces numerous articles of potential trade, and I think we have somewhat of a different route on, and it depends on the chemistry of that article. I think the low THC articles for oral use, I think the dietary supplement route should work. I think it's a pretty good route. As I said, I'm going to complain about the GMP rule, but we're learning how to comply with it, and we'll improve it over time. The AER part is really good for us. Again, the fear is, from those who aren't in the room, how many people are you hurting? We'd love to say. We'd love to be able to say, well, we have this many, and it would be hundreds, of adverse events reported to the Food and Drug Administration each year, and we don't see anything pattern-like about it. We don't see anything that is of such concern that we've established a safety fear. So I do think that if you take the THC out, it's very difficult for me to think that there'd be any tolerance for THC products as supplements. And of course, anything that you smoke, that's not a dietary supplement. That's a whole different thing. So I think that each of the, and again, what HIA has shown in the work that they've done with the oil, those are foods now. Those are being manufactured under the food GMP. They're complying with food labeling requirements. They've got a whole new GMP coming, and we should talk about that sometime because there's going to be a huge increase on the GMP burden for foods, for all foods. But I think that's what I see as the route. It depends on the ingredient, and the one that we don't yet have the answer for is the high THC products. And then I go to, let's treat, those are the ones that we want to treat like alcohol, respect the state's rights, get the feds out of the way, work with the Department of the Treasury Tax and Trade Bureau is an agency that I have to deal with already on alcohol and tinctures. They're a great organization. They're one of the few regulatory agencies that understands that they work for us. It's really a good place to have a relationship in the federal government. I think that would be where I'd try to go with the model of the end of prohibition in alcohol. What can we learn with that? And that's where the THC effective product should be.
Any other questions? Do you guys have any closing remarks? Anything else that hasn't been said? Anything else?
Thank you, staff.
So while we're closing today, the conference is not over. I know there's been a lot of information, but tomorrow we have a lot going on, actually. We have, if you registered for the conference, we have a whole series of advocacy trainings that were covered under the cost of the registration. So if you registered for this conference, you can go to any of those educational tracks. But there's also a series of sort of advanced education that we're doing, that we've partnered with other organizations to bring you that education. So there's a CME course in the morning. There is a course in the afternoon looking at methodologies for testing cannabis. There's also a series of sort of advanced PFC courses on sustainable gardening, on how to create batch standards, and how to prepare samples for labs. And then there's also the core cannabis course that's taught in the afternoon. That's also a part of the PFC program. So if you want to go to any of those, just look at your program, and it's pretty clear what is already covered. And you can go buy those tickets at registration until 6 o'clock. And of course, you can buy those in the morning. Also, this evening in this room at 8 p.m., there's going to be a viewing of the Culture High for folks that would like to see that. And again, I just want to thank all of the speakers, all of the panelists for an amazing day. A special thank you to Dioscorides, to Dr. Bronner, and to Grace Analytics for their support and bringing so many, providing so many scholarships. We're able to provide 160 scholarships this year to patients around the country. And that is why we have people represented from 41 states. So thank you guys so much for all of your advice and your work over the year. Have a great night. I need a glass of wine.